Welcome to Discovering. They're much more abundant than you may think, and they love it here in the UP. We'll take a look at salamanders.
And you rarely ever see them, so you can find them in ponds during the breeding season.
And we'll check back on the tree harvesting and planting at Hanley Field. Stick around, it's Monday night and time for Discovering.
The secret streams that flow beneath the cliffs of colored stone. Forest thick and healthy with birch and pine and oak. Surrounded by the greatest lakes this world has ever known. The black bear's awesome presence as he roams the hills and fields. Call of the timber wolf, the loon's lonesome trill. The eagle soaring high above, the trout lies deep and still. These are what I treasure, the only way I measure feelings that I have for this fine land. There is so much to discover when you're a long-time lover of northern Michigan.
Last week, we took a look at a variety of springtime wetland inhabitants. That lineup of seldom seen critters was actually a bonus to what I initially set out to shoot. I wanted to find out more about salamanders. And as typically happens when I get together with ecologist Ryan Rutherford, I found out there is more than meets the eye.
So we're going to learn a lot about salamanders today. So right now I'm standing in an ephemeral pond, and what an ephemeral pond is it's a pool of water that doesn't hold water all year long. So a pond like this might hold water early on in spring after snowmelt through May, through June, and then probably dry out sometime in August or later on in July. But what that means for salamanders is that there is no fish, because they would need a pond that's permanent, where there's water all year round or a stream. So this is a unique environment in which salamanders can survive and fish are precluded. So early on in the springtime, after the snow melts, they'll migrate here, lay their eggs, and there's no fish to compete with them, so they tend to do really well. They feed on mosquito larvae, and you can see right here are some eggs. These are the eggs of the spotted salamander, one of our very first to come here and breed. They'll lay the egg mass and they'll deposit this jelly, and then as they lay it, the jelly will expand and take on water, so they end up becoming a lot larger than they originally were. You can see the little individual embryos around them too. If you look really closely, you can see an algae start to grow on the embryos. That's a kind of algae called salamander algae. It's actually only on salamander eggs. It's called Oophilia ambistomatalis, which directly means egg-loving mole salamander, which is what these guys are. They're in the mole salamander family. And these guys will stay in an egg form for just a few weeks, and then they'll hatch out into tiny little salamander larvae, and they'll develop over a period of a couple of months. They'll feed on small invertebrates in the water, and then they'll emerge normally mid-July to early August before the pond dries up. Now, so here's another spotted salamander egg mass. Another thing that's really interesting about these is they can withstand being out of the water for several days at a time. So this gelatinous coating around them keeps the embryos nice and moist. I've seen ponds that have dried up really early in the springtime and then had no water there for a week or more, and then they finally got rain, and they hatched and turned out just fine. So it's a pretty nice adaptation to changing conditions. That's where that algae starts to grow, and it can grow right inside of that jelly, and it provides oxygen for the growing embryos, and the algae get a place to reside during the process too. So it's thought to be a symbiotic partnership between the two species. So here are several egg masses here. These are all from the spotted salamander. You can see the middle one though is all kind of milky and murky, and this happens when you get an egg mass that's not fertilized. So you'll have a whole bunch of males come in here, and they'll be competing for the females. They will lay little structures on the bottom of the pond called spermatophores, and the females, if they're following that male, can come pick them up, and then they'll lay fertilized eggs. But sometimes an unfertilized egg mass gets laid, such as that. And if you come here on a night after a big rain early on in the spring, and they're all active, you can see them in the water churning around, coming up, and they kind of do this little dance that's called a Liebesspiel courtship dance, where they'll They'll come up, get a gulp of air and go walk around on the bottom. To see a whole bunch of them together is pretty amazing. So right here we're seeing a really high abundance of blue spotted salamander eggs. Look at these branches, they're absolutely covered with eggs, hundreds and hundreds. So unlike the spotted salamander, blue spotted salamanders will lay several small clusters. So you'll get clusters of just 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 eggs, but there'll be a whole bunch of them. So they have a much different appearance. They can cover complete branches like this. And the larvae that hatch out of there are strictly predatory. They have gills and they have very large mouths that they'll use to consume invertebrates. So they don't eat plant material or anything like that. They're entirely carnivorous and they grow really fast. And they'll sprout 2 little front legs, and then by the time that they get close to developing, they'll sprout their back legs. They'll absorb the gills into their body and they'll come out just like mini adult salamanders. These are the eggs of the spotted salamander, which is black with yellow spots. So these guys are amazingly cold tolerant. They'll walk to these ponds over the snow and deposit the eggs here, and they deposit them in these large masses. At least this species does. And you can easily recognize the difference between these ones here and these eggs right next to them, which are much looser. Notice how these are much looser and they're in smaller clusters. These are the eggs of the similar blue spotted salamander. You can see how they hang like jelly. They're pretty easy to tell apart. So in ephemeral ponds here in the UP, there are generally 3 salamanders that you look for early on in the springtime. We have the spotted, the blue spotted salamanders, and you can easily recognize their egg masses. The one that's trickier to find is the four-toed salamander. And they prefer areas like this. So they like it where you have moss sticking up out of the pond. And they'll lay their eggs directly in the moss. So we look for them just by looking in the moss like this. They're really unique among our salamander species in that they prefer to nest right here in this moss, just above the water line. Where other salamanders will lay eggs directly in the water, they'll lay theirs right on the moss here. And so you just look in the moss right here, and there's one right here. Oh, she's diving under a little bit. You can see her up there, she is. Look at that. Pretty widespread in the UP, but few people ever get to see these because they're so difficult to find unless you know exactly where to look. And this is a female. You can tell because she has a really thick body. She'll lay her eggs right here in this moss, and she can move them up and down depending on the changing water level. And she'll stay with them for over a month. And these guys are in the lungless salamander family Plethodontidae. So they don't have any lungs. They're able to absorb all the oxygen that they need directly through their skin, which keeps their size pretty small, and it makes them have to stay in a moist environment for their entire lives. So this whole area was glaciated 10,000 years ago, and there weren't any salamanders here. And these guys had to walk all the way here from the southern US, probably from the Appalachian Mountains, which is currently the hotspot for salamander diversity on planet Earth. And this species still occurs down there now. And if I flip her over, you can see the belly pattern, which is really distinct. We don't have another salamander like this. Another thing that's unique about them is they have a constriction right here on their tail that can actually snap off. If a predator were to grab this, she could snap it off, and that part of the tail would regrow. And if you look on her face, you can see little structures right around her nostrils that they use to detect chemical cues. So these guys live in a chemical environment. Now as humans, we're pretty visual animals. We detect most of what we see by sight, some by smell. We don't have a very good sense of chemical detection, but this allows them to detect substances in the water. It detects where other salamanders are. So they're pretty cued into their chemical environment, which is pretty true for a lot of amphibians. So part of my work has been a UP-wide herp survey, and before starting our work, these were only known from 7 counties in the UP, and now they're known from all 15. This is currently listed on the regional forest or sensitive species list for our national forest, but there's some pretty healthy populations there, but they are really pure and pristine environments. And this forest that we're in here underneath hemlock trees provides a cool year-round climate for this particular species that they just love. So this water is going to stay nice and cool all summer because of our overstory. So several of these hemlocks are probably pretty old, and this is going to really influence the water temperature down here. So this is the lovely spotted salamander. They're in the mole salamander family. Salamanders are a group of animals that have been around on planet Earth for a very long time, hundreds of millions of years. They were animals that looked very similar to this at the same time that we had dinosaurs. And they're very good at detecting chemical cues. You see there's a lot of pits right around their snout that they'll use to pick up on the presence of other members of their same species. They can detect chemicals in the water. And this species, you can even identify individuals by the spot pattern on their back. They're a long-lived species. Individual can live over a decade, which for an amphibian is a pretty long time. And you rarely ever see them, so you can find them in ponds during the breeding season. The best way to find them is to go out at night with a flashlight in ephemeral ponds. And if you get there during a breeding aggregation, you'll see quite a display. They do a courtship dance where they'll crawl along the bottom. They'll come up and gulp for air and go back down again in large groups. And it looks like they're dancing. And at any given time, there are more males than females at a breeding site. The females will come, they'll pick up a packet of sperm from a male, they'll lay their eggs, and then they will leave, where the males will tend to stay around longer. So this is probably a male. They've been breeding in this pond for a little while now. But during the summertime, they go underground. That's why they call them mole salamanders. They spend a lot of time in the ground, and they're inactive for a good portion of the year, but they do come out and are most active early on in the spring. They're also an excellent habitat indicator. They're a sign of good, healthy water quality. Even though they're rarely seen, they're actually very abundant in the UP, where you have a lot of ponds and hardwood forest. And he's moving because he doesn't really like the sun. They are mostly nocturnal when they're active on the surface, and then when they're not active on the surface, they're underground. So it probably looks extremely bright to them. You can see the ribs too, right through the skin. They call those grooves coastal grooves, and that's a good way to identify them. Oh, as if the spots wasn't obvious enough, but other salamanders that are more difficult to ID, you can tell by counting those grooves. So this is our other common mole salamander species. This is the blue-spotted salamander. It's much skinnier than the spotted, and you can see the blue flecks all over its bodies. And they also come out very early on in the springtime, lay their eggs in ponds. But these guys tend to stay more on the surface and go underground less frequently than the spotted salamander. One of their defense displays is to gently move their tail. You can see this one's probably a little bit agitated, and they'll sometimes emit kind of a latexy, waxy substance that's very unpleasing to predators. So it's one of their defenses. And these guys can be really abundant. This salamander is probably more tolerant to disturbance than other species. He'll venture a little bit further from the forest than the spotted salamander. And they can also be in more heavily managed, modified landscapes, even ponds within cities. So a pretty adaptable species. So not all of our salamander species are tied to wetlands. We do have one species that does not have a stage that lives in the water, and that's the redback salamander. And they prefer forests like this. This is a northern hardwood forest. It's dominated by sugar maples and yellow birches. So we're going to flip some logs, and then that's the preferred habitat. So they can be really abundant in this habitat, but they can be a little bit tricky to find. So this is the amazing redback salamander, and they're in the lungless salamander family. They are able to obtain all of their oxygen right through their skin, which keeps them attached to moist environments. But the really unique thing about these guys is they live only in upland forests, so they're not aquatic species. And these guys can be extremely abundant. There was a study done in the same sort of habitat, northern hardwood forest in New Hampshire, that found that this one species of salamander, if you weighed up every individual for that forest, it weighed as much as all the mammals and was twice that of all the birds, which is incredibly amazing. So they're an important member of our leaf litter duff community within forests. They also have the ability to lose their tail and regrow it, and I can tell that's happened to this individual here. You can see originally its tail would have been all red, but then it must have broke off and then it grew back. It grew back this more gray color. And they normally live inside logs, under leaves, and they feed on small critters, small invertebrates. In really moist conditions, if it's raining, they can come out at night, and they can even crawl up into trees and shrubs. I'm not sure how high they can climb, but they don't stay just down in the leaf litter. So they're important little micro predators in our forest communities. And they're also a good indicator of good forest management. So if all the downwoody debris is gone, if there's no logs and sticks within a particular forest, these salamanders can be quite rare. In older forests or forests that are well managed, that leave a lot of that downwoody material, they can be extremely abundant. If you look inside this salamander, this is a female, you can see the developing eggs in there, and she'll lay these eggs inside this log later on in the summer and will stay there and guard them until they hatch. That abdomen is somewhat translucent. You can see the inside the salamander right through the skin.
Back in February, I was at the Hanley Field Airstrip just south of Munising on Highway 13, where I met with forester Matt Watkies to talk about the red pine harvesting project that had already begun. The harvesting is now complete, and I was back for a look at the planting portion of the project.
So yeah, we were here on this site last winter talking about the red pine that was planted here by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and now it's come full cycle. After a few thinnings that were done by the Forest Service, we've had a complete final harvest here. The land is now owned again by Alger County. It's managed by the Hanley Airstrip Committee, and so they knew these trees were ready to go. You know, had a little fungal rot in the roots, definitely mature enough, you know, little crown ratio. It was time for these red pine to be harvested. They went as utility poles, high value timber. The logging job was done exemplary by Bear Creek Logging out of Gulliver, Michigan, and we're really happy with the job that he did for us. So now our job is to replant the site, reforest the site.
After a clear cut of a pine stand, as we're looking at here, responsible forestry brings you to the next step is reforestation. They've come in, they've clear cut an old growth pine stand. We're coming back in with seedlings, and they are red pine as well, to reforest the area back and get the stand growing once again.
If we didn't do this replanting, you wouldn't really have desirable species that would regenerate here. It is a very sandy site. There are some hardwoods, cherry, maple, but there's also a lot of beech brush and beech saplings in here that would really take over the site because beech trees grow very fast. So to make this productive again, we're replanting it to red pine plugs, which are 1-year-old nursery seedlings. It's being done by the crew here from Timberland Forestry and also Evergreen Nursery in Rumley, Michigan.
So what we're using out here today is containerized red pine seedlings. The containerized part is what's known as a plug, and the root system is in a plug of dirt. So the roots form and they hold the dirt all in. These are the growing roots, the white ends, as they're showing that they're already started coming out of dormancy. You got a bud that's starting to push out. But this plug of dirt and all the fine lateral roots that this plug holds will ensure survivability, and it'll ensure growability. You can get trees in the ground to be alive, but you don't always get them when they're going to grow as fast as possible. Dry spring like we're having right now, this will give us the benefits of being able to withstand this dry weather before it gets enough moisture to move on. The survivability, the growability of the container is far superior to anything else that is out on the markets these days. You're usually looking at 95% without too much problem. We're looking at putting about 900 trees per acre back into the stand. That'll get you to about a 6 by 8 spacing, 6 feet between trees, 8 feet between rows. We'll be looking at probably maybe roughly 48,000 seedlings it'll take to reforest the old cut. We produce the seedlings at Evergreen Nursery, which is in Rumley, Michigan. We produce about 1 million containerized seedlings that go throughout the UP to reforest and provide wildlife habitat all through the Upper Peninsula, Northern Lower Peninsula. These are purchased, you say these are grown right there. They're UP grown, UP planted. As we get down the road to about 30 years out, this will be thinned once, probably be thinned again another 15, and maybe even again after another 15. So you want to run your rows so they can get in there and do alternate row thinning. And what's just known as row thinning, they'll pick certain rows and they'll just clear the whole row. So we're going to run these, kind of orientate them similar to the direction they were. So we'll be running along with the old stumps in the similar direction, so that it'll once again will facilitate thinning in previous years.
We're also going to be replanting a windbreak that is about 50 to 60 feet away from the main road, which is Forest Highway 13 here. The windbreak is going to consist of 4-year-old nursery stock, including spruce and red pine. Spruce trees are a little bit fuller down towards the ground as opposed to red pine, which have more of a crown on the top. So the goal is here, the red pine will be a little taller, and the spruce, being fuller and shorter, will fill in some of those gaps in between the red pine and really do a good job of intercepting the snow that does blow along Highway 13 here. It's going to take some time, so we definitely ask for the public's understanding in that, and just being aware that this was clear cut this year. In the next couple years, as you're driving up and down Forest Highway 13 during the snow, be aware there might be some snow drifts in this area.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next week right here on Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.